Jordan Peterson recently debated 20 atheists on the YouTube program Jubilee.
If there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
Dr. Peterson sits in the middle of 20 atheists in chairs circling him who rush to a chair to debate him over one of Peterson's claims. I can't think of anyone more qualified or interesting to give his response than our guest today, Dr. William Lane Craig, who has arguably debated the leading atheists over the past few decades. My team and I have pulled together a few clips for Dr. Craig to give us his responses to. Now, Dr. Craig has not seen the entire debate and is reacting to these isolated clips, so please go back and watch the debate in its entirety for context analysis and comparison. Dr. Craig, this is a ton of fun. I am personally looking forward to your thoughts. Thanks for doing this.
I am glad to do this. I think this is a remarkable format that Jubilee has put together. It is so entertaining and at the same time, really informative. So I think it's a wonderful event, and I'm glad to have a chance to comment.
Well, let's jump in at the first clip and then get your take.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Let me say two things about this. First, Sean, I think that the claim is very plausibly true. I think that atheists generally don't have the concept of God as a maximally great being, a being that is necessary, self-existent, eternal, spaceless, immaterial, perfectly good. They do not generally have this sort of majestic, philosophically rich concept of God. The philosopher David Hunt once remarked to me that he thinks that God is a lot more like Plotinus I than like Zeus. And I think for many atheists, God is more like Zeus than he is like Plotinus I. And I would say, Sean, frankly, that this is a case for Christians as well, that most Christians do not have a very full-orbed, philosophically deep concept of God. So if Christians don't even understand what God is like, how much more is that true for the average non-believer? Now, the second thing, though, that I'd like to comment on this is that this claim, whether true or false, is just irrelevant to the truth of Christian theism. The issues that Jordan Peterson has chosen to talk about are sociological, historical claims that you could go either way with. The Christian faith, if true, doesn't imply either the affirmative or the negative answer to these questions. So in that sense, I don't think these are really the important questions that he's raising. These are tangential questions because they're ultimately irrelevant to the truth of Christian theism. There's no discussion in this exchange about arguments for God's existence, no discussion of evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and Jesus. Instead, we get these socio-historical sorts of questions, which isn't surprising because Dr. Peterson is a psychiatrist after all. And so he's sticking to his area of expertise. But while that's a good thing for him to do, unfortunately, it leaves us really deficient in terms of arguments and evidence for and against the truth of Christianity.
I think both those points are really helpful. And I appreciate that you said it's plausibly true and generally true. Could we really know that this is absolutely true? In my experience, I would just say it's often right. In my interaction, not always. Many times I'll ask atheists, and by the way, Christians, but in particular atheists, can you tell me about the God you don't believe in? And as I listen more and more, there's a caricature or a depiction of God that I would argue doesn't line up with the scriptures. Now, part of Peterson's argument is he points back towards in the Old Testament, and Moses has this view through the cleft of God, just to point out that kind of as finite beings, we only have a glimpse of the infinite. And there's truth in that. But obviously, if we have a glimpse of God, that's enough for a believer like Moses to believe. But that's also enough for somebody to reject God in principle and have a sufficient knowledge of who God is. And I think Romans makes this clear when it talks about the wrath of God being revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, for what can be known about God is plain to them. And then verse 21, for although they knew God. So I think his point in part is that we don't have exhaustive knowledge of God. And I say, of course, but we have sufficient knowledge of God to believe and to reject. I think that's the key point that's a takeaway here.
Social animals, which we are, right, require some level of morality or...
Into what? I'm not disagreeing.
Sure.
Why do they require that?
Because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that?
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
How's that not scientific?
Well, because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just indicated.
It doesn't need to derive from the scientific process. It's the fact that we are social animals, and we need that to exist as a group.
I agree,
right?
but you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how that works.
That's my point.
Science explains it. So
no, science doesn't explain morality.
It doesn't explain how social animals would need to be.
Well, that's a complicated question.
But we see it, though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
Dr. Craig, this clip is rooted in Peterson's second prompt, namely that morality and purpose cannot be found within science. What do you make of this contention and this interaction?
Again, I think that the contention is obviously true. Science doesn't explore ethics. That's a totally different discipline than the exploration of the natural physical world. So what he's saying is obviously true, I think, and most ethicists would concur. Unfortunately, I don't think he does a very good job of defending his thesis against the challenges of his interlocutor. What the challenger wants to say is that in virtue of our being social animals, there has evolved a kind of herd morality among Homo sapiens, which is useful in the perpetuation of our species. And so it gets selected for by biological evolution. And you see similar patterns of cooperation among other social animals like pigs and elephants, for example. And Peterson does make the claim, which is correct, that explaining how moral beliefs evolve is not the same as explaining the moral beliefs. What the student tries to explain is, how do we come to have the moral beliefs that we do? And he wants to appeal to this socializing effect. But even if that were true, that doesn't provide a foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. To do that, you need to go outside the natural realm. Otherwise, all you're left with is no normativity. You're simply left with these ingrained patterns of behavior that could have been quite different if you rewound the film of biological evolution and shot it anew. A very different type of creature might have evolved with a very different set of values. So I think the two here are talking at cross purposes with each other. And I wish that Peterson could have been clearer in articulating and defending his view.
Again, that's helpful. Peterson goes on to describe how it's not in science, but kind of in the religious realm, so to speak, that we need to ground morality. But I think his point here is that science cannot explain morality, but assumes morality. In itself, that's an interesting point. that science cannot provide a justification for objective moral values and duties, but assumes it. I mean, to be specific, much of the scientific project relies upon trusting the testimony of others who we assume will document and report their findings accurately.
Right.
Built into the scientific endeavor is that we have moral obligations such as truth-telling. Therefore, science cannot explain its existence. It assumes it. And I would argue, and I know you would too separately, that there's a bunch of other assumptions that science begins with that are more at home in a theistic worldview than in a naturalistic worldview. Now, in fairness, of course, some atheists would point towards justification for morality outside of science, but that goes beyond Peterson's case here.
Okay, if there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
Well, in the Christian tradition, the purpose of life is to engage in voluntary, upward, self-sacrifice so that the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth.
Bill, is Jordan Peterson right that in the Christian tradition, the purpose of life is voluntary, upward self-sacrifice so the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth?
Well, that's not the way I understand it, Sean. I think the Westminster Catechism has best expressed what the purpose of life is, and that is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Our end is to be found in fellowship with God, in an eternal love relationship with Him, and this is the fulfillment of human being.
That's well said. I think as I wrestled with his explanation, I think he's partly right. You know, when Jesus is asked the greatest commandment, he says, love God and love others. Like you said, fellowship, relationship. You know, in John 17:4, he says, and this is eternal life, that they know you, the one true God. You could argue that God put Adam and Eve in the garden to care for it so he might dwell among them, so to speak. Abraham is called up to, go start leading the people of Israel out. Ultimately, they end up in the land, and in the Exodus with Moses, we're told in Exodus 29:45, so that he may dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God. I think part of the new heavens and new earth is that we would dwell with God in relationship. So how we get there might be through self-sacrifice. That might be the means. But the purpose of life, I think, like you said, in the classical Christian tradition, is to know God and know others and to bring glory to God through doing so.
I think what Peterson does is make a fundamental confusion that is so common between being and doing. So many people think that the Christian life is about doing. What do we do for God? What are my duties to perform? What do I have to do? Where the Christian life is fundamentally, really, as you just said, it's about being. It's about being in relationship with God, the source of all goodness and love.
So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean when you say you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if you believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action. And you're either fragmented, in which case you worship multiple gods, or there's some unity at the bottom of it that makes you an unstoppable force.
Bill, given that you've written extensively on what faith and belief in God means, in your volume 1 on systematic philosophical theology, I've been really eager for your take on his description of belief in God.
This is exactly what came to my mind, Sean. He is describing as belief, acting as if your life depended on it. And this is consistent with pretending. You make believe that it's true. You act as if it were true, and that isn't what belief really is. I think, contrary to what Peterson just said, the belief does involve propositional truth. It is saying that it is true that God exists. And therefore, belief in the Christian sense does definitely involve commitment to propositional truths, not just acting as if your life depended on something.
Mm. One of my concerns is that he seems to imply that belief is absolute, all or nothing. And it seems to me that belief can come in degrees. We can have greater and lesser confidence that something is true, maybe experience, maybe evidence, testimony from somebody else. And I think the definition concerns me because it sets such a high standard for Christians who think, gosh, I believe this, but have I really staked everything on it? Would I die for this? You know, maybe they have questions and doubts, think I'm not a believer, or an unbeliever looking in going, well, I'm inclined towards this being true, but I'm not at that full scale level that he has. I appreciate that he's emphasizing the side of belief that means to stake your life on it, but it just concerns me that maybe that's what being belief is reduced down to at the expense of, like you said, propositional belief and the graded nature of belief.
Right.
Everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
Peterson's third claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it. What's your take on this prompt?
Well, I'm open to persuasion about this. I don't have any firm opinion. As I say, all of these claims that Peterson makes are really not relevant to the truth of Christianity. So I don't know whether this claim is true or not. I do know that the theologian Paul Tillich defined God as one's object of ultimate concern. And so by that definition, everybody has some ultimate concern and would therefore believe in some sort of God object, some object of ultimate concern. So I think that Peterson's view is defensible. It's certainly one that many have held to. So I'm open-minded on this.
That's a good response. There's some confusion back and forth with some of the atheists that jump up, assuming worship means pray to, bow down to, formally sacrifice to, whereas Peterson does take more of the approach that you're saying here, kind of an ultimate concern that guides my life, like a higher authority that I attend to.
Yeah, so, that's clear. The students have just misunderstood him.
Yeah, and some of that comes out in the dialogue, which I think is interesting because in that sense, I think he's probably right that we all have some guiding higher call. Maybe it's a human relationship, maybe it's a hobby, maybe it's a profession. There's some higher guiding principle that motivates us. And if he's right, then the question would not be, or the question would be, everybody worships something. So it's not, do we worship? It's what do we worship? So if he's right, Christians and atheists both worship something. The question is, what is the orientation of the worship or direction of our life? And I think what's so fascinating about this is, at least biblically speaking, the ultimate sin is idolatry, which is to worship something other than the Creator. So I don't know if Peterson did this intentionally or not, but it kind of invites people to ask the question, what am I worshiping? What's the ultimate commitment of my life and why? And that's where I think the format of Jubilee invites like debate and proving he's wrong rather than leaning in and asking questions. So for anybody watching this, rather than taking sides, just ask the question, what does Peterson really mean? Could he be right about this? And what might my ultimate concern be? That would be my takeaway for people watching this.
Yeah, very good.
You're saying atheists worship things or people or places, whatever. Can you be very clear about your definition of worship again?
Attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for.
Okay, that's it. That's your understanding of worship.
Well, I could flesh it out, but that'll do for the time we have.
Okay. Do Catholics attend to Mary?
Well, yes.
Okay. So do they fit that description of worship?
Yes.
So you would say Catholics and other people that revere Mary, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, worship Mary.
Well, they might not put her in the highest
But
place.
you would put it that way.
No.
You just said it. Now you're taking it back
There's
now?
still a hierarchy.
Okay, there's a hierarchy, but within the
There's something at the top.
All right, you can worship things
Mary
below.
is quite a ways up the hierarchy, but not at the top.
Let's go over your definition of worship again. What's your definition of worship?
Attend to,
Attend to. Do
prioritize, and
Catholics
sacrifice for.
do Catholics attend to? Do they prioritize Mary over all other human beings?
No, I didn't say overall, did I? I didn't add that to my definition.
You understand?
I said there was a hierarchy as well.
You attend to
So you can attend to something trivially, or you can attend to it deeply.
Okay, now you're adding stuff to the definition. But your original
I
definition.
added the hierarchy part at the beginning.
Are you
just
familiar?
didn't understand it.
Are you familiar with the Immaculate Conception?
Why is that relevant?
Because you go to a Catholic church, don't you? Or you've attended recently. You're interested in Catholicism, aren't you?
Sure,
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrines?
somewhat.
Okay, you're
Their
familiar.
doctrines are very
how do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either
it,
you're a
'cause
Christian
I won't
or you're
talk to
not.
you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression
private.
I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video,
You're really quite something, you are.
aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
Dr. Craig, this clip has gone viral for a bunch of reasons. There's a bunch of angles and critique we could give, but I'm really curious your takeaway from it.
I think that this kid just exemplifies the attitude of trying to have a gotcha moment. He's not really interested in exploring the truth of Peterson's claim. He just wants to say gotcha. And even if the kid is right, that Peterson's definition of worship would imply that Catholics worship Mary, so what? How does that affect anything except to say that perhaps the definition is inadequate? And I think you and I would agree that indeed the definition is inadequate, that that worship involves taking God as the object of ultimate concern. And that's certainly not what Catholics do with Mary. But the more fundamental point is, I think Peterson's right. The kid is a smartass. He's not really interested in the questions of truth. He just wants to show up Jordan Peterson and expose that Peterson is committed to Catholics worshiping Mary. Who cares?
So I think that's a fair take. One perspective I might add is, from what I understand, they originally called this video One Christian versus 20 Atheists. And the atheists who came were told this was going to be a Christian. So there's a little bit of they're finding this out in the moment. And so, and Jubilee, the way it's set up, I love it. I watch a bunch of them. I think it's fascinating, but it invites a sense of like, you have the clock for a moment. So you've got to make your point fast or you're going to get voted off. But certainly he could have gone about it differently, as some of the other people in this Jubilee did, and invited more of a conversation than a gotcha moment. In some ways, Bill, this was maybe the most interesting clip to me because this moment was kind of inevitable. As you know, you've been on stage with Peterson, I believe, in different settings, that people have been wondering, where does he stand on God? Where does he stand on the resurrection? Even atheists like Dawkins and O'Connor have been in conversation with him, pressing him, does he think these stories are actually true? And he's been evasive for a while about his beliefs. And if you're not a Christian, that makes sense. Or if you're a Christian, it's fine to be evasive about like the imprisoned spirits in 1 Peter chapter 3. But if you're a Christian, you cannot be evasive about professing Christ before people. We
Well,
see,
that's true.
I mean, that is very clear. So to me, I think this made it clear for those of us who wondered where Jordan Peterson stands. He's not there yet, implying I hope
Let's be
he gets there.
careful not to judge.
Okay.
Sean, we don't know his heart. He's certainly evasive. And I think that that's deliberate myself. If I were his publicity agent, I would say, be as evasive as you can. Do not answer the question.
Okay.
So long as he
Okay.
keeps evading it, that evokes the mystery, that promotes the controversy. You said this is one of the most watched clips in the whole program. Why? Because of this evasion, where if he were to just come out and say, I am a Christian and I believe in Jesus, my Lord, the mystery would be gone, the controversy over, it would be boring after that. So this is very deliberate, I think. And we have to be careful not to judge whether in his heart of hearts, he hasn't yet come to believe in Christ, but he's still a baby Christian and doesn't have it all together yet, or maybe finds it to his advantage to be evasive. But your point is certainly well taken. For someone who is a genuine Christ follower, he must confess Christ before men. Jesus said, anyone who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. But whoever confesses me before men will be confessed before the angels of God. So we need to be bold proclaimers of the gospel of Christ.
Very fair. That's a great take. Appreciate that, Bill. Let's take a look at clip number 7.
My final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories. Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's
I'm
your
Ian.
name?
I'm Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Yes. So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
All right, Dr. Craig, this is one you've clearly heard before and dealt with, but is Peterson right that atheists accept Christian morality but deny the religion's foundational stories? And what do you make of this young man jumping right in on slavery and genocide?
Yeah, I think that Peterson's claim is, again, a very plausibly true socio-historical claim. Everybody knows that Western civilization and its mores have been shaped by Christianity. Christianity has been the most powerful influence in the West. And so even unbelievers like these students who are born and raised in Western culture will have largely adopted Christian values. I think as a socio-historical claim, that is almost indisputable. And so I think Peterson's claim is right and isn't refuted by this student trying to show inconsistencies in Old Testament ethics. Now, watching this, it occurred to me that Peterson could easily deflect this objection, if I'm not mistaken, by saying that his claim was about Christian ethics. Isn't that correct? Wasn't his claim that Christian morality?
Yeah, he talked about Christian morality and the foundational stories being at the religion's basis.
Could you repeat that again, Sean? You froze momentarily.
Oh, yeah. So he's saying that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories.
Right. So what he could say is, look, young man, I'm not talking about the Old Testament. I'm talking about the New Testament. My claim was about Christian ethics, the ethics of Jesus and the church. And so these incidents that you're protesting against aren't part of Christian ethics. And so what the student would have to show is that Western culture hasn't been shaped by New Testament ethics, and that he himself hasn't absorbed the values of that culture. It just is irrelevant to the claim to point to these atrocities in the Old Testament.
I had a couple thoughts on this one.
Sure, go ahead.
Peterson does a really good job in his book, We Who Wrestle with God, of working through these grand Old Testament stories of Elijah, of Jonah, of Moses. And he mentions some of these troubling stories, but does so in light of the larger narrative of the Old Testament. So he studied the Old Testament in depth and asks, how do these stories fit in with the theme of the Old Testament, the character of the Old Testament God? And my challenge just would be for people who are watching this, rather than starting with the troubling passages, I would never say ignore them, but this young man jumps up and goes, genocide, slavery, and those are tough passages. I want to say, let's slow down in the way Peterson has done this and really try to understand them within their context and time and place first. And then I think we'll have more tools to begin to make sense of them. So for anybody watch this, I say just hit pause. Those are fair questions. Bill and I have dealt with those in different times and in different ways. But would you lean in first and straw man the God of the Old Testament and in light of the New Testament, like you said, before doing so? That would be one point I would make.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to this one, Bill?
Well, I just want to emphasize again that these students are raising objections that are not pertinent to the claims that Peterson is making. The claim is that even atheists accept Christian morality while they reject the foundational stories behind them. And that seems to me to be very, very plausibly true in Western culture. And nothing the student said refutes that socio-historical claim that Peterson is making.
One quick question for you. The way he framed this gave me a little pause, is I wouldn't ground Christian ethics in the foundational stories. Like you, I would ground it in the character of God. And we know about the character of God in many ways as expressed through the stories and through the scriptures. So I think that's where he invites analysis of the stories instead of the character of God, metaphysically speaking, and somewhat opens himself up for these critiques.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
All right, let's take a look at the next one.
People like Graham Oppie make arguments about the incompatibility of omniscience and free will, that if God created this world, if he chose this world instead of that world, then he makes it causally inevitable every single action that you were going to make. If he made a world where we were just electrons in love, then none of this would have happened. But by making us in this world, knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future, it makes all of those events inevitable, which means that they're all causally determined, which means that we have no free will. If you believe in an all-good God or an all-knowing God that made everything.
Well, have it your way.
I know for sure you've thought about this one because I've heard you respond over and over again to it. So bottom line is omniscience incompatible with free will.
The student makes a fundamental confusion between fatalism and causal determinism. He thinks that if God foreknows what will happen in the future, then everything is fated to occur. Everything that occurs necessarily. And then he conflates that with the affirmation of causal determinism, that everything is determined to happen. And that's just a fundamental confusion. Fatalism is logically fallacious. From the fact that God foreknows what will happen, and that God's knowledge is infallible, it doesn't follow that everything that happens necessarily. All that follows is that it will happen, but it could fail to happen, in which case God would have had different foreknowledge than the foreknowledge that he does have. So there's simply no incompatibility demonstrable between divine foreknowledge and future acts of free will. And the student is quite incorrect about this, and especially I was puzzled by the reference to Graham Oppie. So far as I know, I don't think Oppie has ever endorsed theological fatalism and said that divine foreknowledge is incompatible with human free will.
There are different kinds of truth claims, right? There's propositional truth claims, which are the truth claims of what you say. And then there's embodied truth claims, which is the truth claims of what you do. That should be prioritized. Optimally, what you say and what you do would be brought into harmony. But I would say if you had to prioritize, it should be what you attend to and what you act first. And that's what Christ actually says in the Gospels, because he points to the Pharisees, for example, who say all the right things, but don't do any of the right things, and points out very clearly that that's not acceptable.
All right, Dr. Craig, are there different kinds of truth claims, propositional claims about what we say, truth claims about what we do, and should we prioritize, especially in light of Jesus' critique of the Pharisees, doing the right things?
Here, I think Jordan Peterson is philosophically confused. To talk about a truth claim is to talk about a proposition that is either true or false. It either corresponds to reality or it does not. And so there's really only one kind of truth claim. There will be these propositional truth claims. What he's talking about, I think, here is living authentically what you say you believe. And if you do not live out what you affirm, that is hypocrisy. That's an inauthentic human existence. And I think he's quite right to say that as human beings, we want to be authentic people who live consistently with our propositional beliefs. And as you know, Sean, I've argued that the atheist can't really do that consistently and happily, that if he lives consistently with his worldview, he will be profoundly unhappy. He will be in despair because his worldview implies that there is ultimately no value, no meaning, no purpose. And that is an unlivable view unless you are in deep depression and despair. So what happens is that the atheist, as Peterson himself said earlier, typically affirms objective moral values. He thinks his life is purposeful. He thinks he and the lives of his children are meaningful, even though he has no basis for it. And this is the definition of inauthentic human existence. I think that the atheist is caught in a terrible predicament, what I call the human predicament, that he's forced to live an inauthentic human existence because of the unlivability of an atheistic worldview with its implications.
That's a great challenge for the atheistic worldview. I think this also gives a challenge for Christians. Os Guinness has written on a number of occasions that he thinks the biggest barrier that turns people away from the faith is hypocrisy. When we say one thing and we do another. And am I talking with people who used to be in the church? Many have such a bad experience with Christians and don't understand how if the things we believe are true and we live differently, why they should become a Christian. So I think that's a huge challenge. I hope Christians watching this will hit pause and make sure we're not saying one thing and doing another. I think Peterson also here in other ways, it pushes back against kind of an easy believism we see in the church. This is, I can just believe and get fire insurance, live however I want to. But on the other end, then it can become a faith of works and actions, like you said, that is a works-based righteousness that Paul, I think, clearly rejects in Ephesians 2:8-9 when he says, grace, it is by grace we have been saved through faith. And in John 6:29, he says, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. So ideally, as Christians, let's line up our actions with our beliefs. That's the challenge for all of us. Bill, as always, this is fun. Do you have any just last thoughts or words of encouragement or anything you want to say at the end?
Well, I would just encourage all of our viewers to take a intro course in elementary logic. I think that these students would be greatly helped if they understood the basic 9 rules of inferential logic. I think many of them lack honed critical thinking skills. And so a basic course in logic would be very helpful, I think, to these students and to our viewers.
That's a great word of advice. And I know you would agree with me on this, that this isn't just because they're atheist students. You would give the same encouragement to 20 Christian students and all students. In fact, probably more so Christian students, even than atheist students. My last encouragement.
Absolutely. I want the Christian students to be the ones that are the true critical thinkers and logical reasoners.
Amen. I would end by saying I enjoy these Jubilee dialogues. I imagine myself sitting there saying, what would I say? How would I respond?
Yes.
And there's a reason they get so many views, but it also can invite a certain kind of like, I want to own somebody. I want this viral moment. Yeah. I'm cheering for somebody and cheering against somebody. So I don't want Christians or Christian apologists watching something like this thinking this is how we necessarily ought to communicate in conversation. But I'd also invite people to watch it. At the very end, Peterson got to pick somebody to have 10-minute dialogue with him on the contention of their choice. And he chose a younger African-American woman, in part because she was really thoughtful, but she also engaged him in a way that wasn't trying this gotcha, own you, in a way that was like trying to benefit the conversation. And she wasn't voted off for a while. So if you watch this, and I hope people do, watch it through the lens of what lessons can I learn to better engage people and talk about it from there. Bill, this is the 3rd time you've done a reaction video with me. We will have you back when you're available and something else like this drops. So for those of you watching, pick up the new Systematic Philosophical Theology Volume 1 and 2 is out. We're going to have Dr. Craig on soon to talk about his 2nd volume. And think about studying apologetics with me. We talk about the content, but also how to engage people at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. Information is below. Thanks, Dr. Craig. Always enjoy it.
Great to be with you, Sean. Thank you.